Welcome to 10 Minutes On, a JPIT podcast, where we dive into the big issues shaping public life and exploring how faith communities can respond. I'm Nathan McGuire, Baptist Minister and Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer for the Joint Public Issues team, your host for today. And today we're tackling a deeply challenging and emotive topic, the Assisted Dying Bill, currently being debated in the UK Parliament. To help us unpack this issue before us, I'm joined by my JPIT colleague and Baptist Minister, Steve Tinning. Steve is the Public Issues Enabler for the Baptist Union of Great Britain. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with some context, Steve. Could you give us a brief overview of the Assisted Dying Bill and where it currently stands in Parliament?
Sure. So the current law is that it is illegal in England and Wales to assist in the end of a person's life. It is punishable by with up to 14 years in prison. It's illegal in Scotland too, but it's a devolved issue. So Scotland are having a parallel debate on a very similar issue. But we have this thing called the Terminally Ill Adults (End of Life) Bill. It's a private member's bill, and it's been brought by MP Kim Ledbetter. That if it's passed, will see over 18s who are terminally ill and want to end their lives be given assistance by medical practitioners to do so legally. It's had its first reading. Its second reading is coming up on the 29th of November, and obviously it's been very much in the news.
Thank you, Steve, for summarising that. You've mentioned first and second reading. What do you mean by these?
Each bill, when it's presented to Parliament, goes through various stages. It's sort of announced, it then has a debate. So these are first and second reading. Then it might enter committee stage, report stage, third reading. It goes to the House of Lords. You go through ping pong. It's a long, protracted pathway for something that begins as a bill to end up as an act and becoming law. This bill is particularly controversial, though, in some ways, because it's a private member's bill. So it's a bill that isn't presented by a government minister. And so before you even get into the content of the bill, there are those who are worried about the limited time a private member's bill gets in parliamentary debates at all stages. There are only a certain number of days given to each parliamentary session for private members' bills. And ordinarily a bill of this kind of magnitude with so much to consider would require a much longer time of analysis and scrutiny. And, the wording of the bill was only released 18 days before the debate at second reading. So some are sensing, a pressure to vote on the bill if they believe in its principles, even if they have concerns about it that might ordinarily challenge or amend further down the line. The risk is if the debate goes on too long, it will run out of time and be lost. So it's quite complicated.
Yeah, and as you said, this is an incredibly sensitive issue. What are some of the arguments for this bill that MPs are likely to hear from their constituents?
This is the problem that we have, don't we? It's exactly the same problem facing Parliament. They have a few hours to debate this on the 29th. We have less than 10 minutes. So forgive me if I don't get to unpack the deep complexities of all the arguments, but a crude summary might be this, that those who are in favour of the change in the law might point first to the safeguards that are being put in place. In order to take part in this, you would have to be a resident of England and Wales. You've got to be registered with a GP for at least 12 months. You have to have mental capacity to make choice. You have to have a diagnosis that will mean that you're expected to die within 6 months. You have to make 2 separate declarations that are witnessed and signed. 2 independent medical practitioners must be satisfied that the person is eligible. A High Court judge then gets involved and has to determine that everything that is being considered has been done so appropriately. And then fundamentally, the person must be able to take the substance themselves. It will not be administered by a medical practitioner, although, of course, they could prepare it. So one of the highest profiled proponents of the bill is Esther Ransom, I guess, the much-loved broadcaster who's been diagnosed with lung cancer, sadly. And she would say that it's a matter of choice. She wants the ability to ask for help and to end her life if at some point in the future she deems it not worth living anymore. So the most commonly held argument for it is this issue of individual liberty, that people should be able to have the choice with what they do with their own bodies. Others see, ending their own life in the midst of suffering a kindness to themselves, but also a kindness to their loved ones who they suspect will be traumatized by witnessing a painful drawn out death of someone that they love. And others point at the fact that, every year hundreds of people who are terminally ill end their lives. Tragically, often they don't have people with them because of fear that those people might be prosecuted. So all too often people die in, lonely and distressing ways. And this alone is sufficient for people to conclude that the current law is insufficient and something needs to be done. That there are many, many other arguments, but I guess those are the headlines that we're seeing most commonly.
That's really helpful. And as you said, there'll also be individuals who have some serious concerns about this bill if it is to be agreed upon and adopted and change in our law. What are some of the implications for our society if this bill was to be adopted into a new law?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, on the other hand, you have those who don't disagree that all this suffering is a tragedy and improvements need to be made, but they're fundamentally against assisted dying. And frequently, they point to the need to improve palliative care, that, end of life care. They might say, you can't offer someone a path to ending their own life if the only other option to them is an inadequate palliative care. That's no choice, they would say. They're not necessarily pointing the finger at palliative care practitioners, who are often praised as some of the most caring and compassionate medical practitioners around. The issue for many is that a lack of investment and some poor practices within the NHS leave people suffering in ways that could be eased if palliative care could be improved. Others, are concerned that those facing terminal illness might feel an obligation to take their own life. Now, obviously, there are safeguards in the bill to punish anyone found to be coercively encouraging someone to end their own life, but it doesn't always have to be that explicit. Some worry that there is an inevitability that some will choose to end their life prematurely because they feel, a practical, emotional, or economic burden to their loved ones. Then there's the slippery slope argument that says that it's all very well putting these safeguards in place in the first instance, but just look at Canada. They legalized assisted dying in 2016, and 1,000 people chose to end their life in that way in that first year. In 2022, over 13,000 had done this. And, that's over 4% of deaths in Canada are aided by doctors. So it started with all the similar debates and similar safeguards, but a couple of years later, the law changed so that you didn't have to have a terminal illness to seek assisted dying. And now debates are being held to expand the criteria to those with mental health conditions. They're considering that in 2027, I think. So the worry is that if we open the door to assisted dying, there is almost an inevitability that safeguards will be loosened in the future. And then I guess lastly, I'd want to say, and again, there are many arguments against this as well, but some focus not just on individual choice and individual liberty, but the wider societal consequences. How will the decision of someone to end their own life impact medical practitioners, and how will they feel about it? Many of them got into medicine to heal, not to end lives. And there'll be a huge emotional pressure on them to abide by this law, legal and emotional pressure. How will relatives feel if they don't want their loved ones to end their lives? And how would they live with that sense of wondering whether they were perceived to be a burden, that their loved ones saw them as a burden to them? The consequences of this go far beyond the individual, others say, and the societal impacts must be considered as well. So those are some, but obviously there are many other concerns.
Yeah. And historically, Christians have spoken out on similar bills in the past. And what are some of the unique perspectives of Christians on this issue?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that most Christians, most churches, most major Christian leaders in the country have been against similar bills in the past, citing many of the arguments that I've just already gone through. But they too might emphasize the sanctity of life. Fundamentally, Christians believe that God created humans in his image and that there is a certain uniqueness about the value of human life. And therefore, to take one's life in some way, dishonors God's gift of life. And if they want to point at scriptures, even something as simple as "thou shalt not kill" is often cited by Christians as there aren't exceptions to that kind of law. And there are those that would say, the the Bible has a consistent teaching around the protection of the vulnerable. And those that are dying are amongst the most vulnerable people that we could possibly imagine. And so rather than thinking of prioritizing an end of physical pain and suffering through death, they would say we need to focus our attention on the protection of those people, the alleviation of their suffering, of course, but by ways that fundamentally protect and honour their lives. But then, on the other hand, there are those who have made arguments from a Christian perspective for a change of law. Some faith leaders argue, like, George Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, has said in the past that while life is sacred, there's nothing sacred about suffering in and of itself. And so no one should be obliged to endure it. It's complicated.
It is. And how are our JPIT denominations and networks responding to the bill?
I think it's true to say that historically all of the JPIT denominations have expressed concern and opposition to bills in the past. So as Baptists, we haven't explicitly expressed an opinion in the way of a resolution from our council or from our assembly, but leaders have joined statements that have fundamentally opposed similar bills in the past. And there are views on both sides, and these have been expressed in articles that people can read on the Baptist Union's website. But most of the communication we're receiving around this bill is in opposition to it. So we have to be honest and realistic about that. The URC last debated the issue in 2007. He said that they didn't support legislation that would empower medical staff to intervene in end-of-life situations. But I think they recognise now that perhaps this view doesn't wholly represent the full membership of the URC today. And so they're encouraging further prayerful study and research and reflection over the next couple of years. Methodists similarly have made a statement on their website. Historically, they've opposed any changes to the law on this issue. I think it was last debated in 2015, in Methodist context. But the Methodist Council has decided not to revisit that church's position, but it has requested production of resources which are widely available on their website. And then the Church of Scotland, they're ahead of us in many ways because this bill came to Scotland last year. Historically, again, they've been very opposed to any change in the law, but again, they recognise that might not fully express the views of all their members. So a committee's been tasked to look at the current position and may bring proposals to their assembly next year. But they're going on a group of roadshows across 10 presbyteries, facilitating conversations with all the necessary resources. But I guess it's most importantly, it's to say that all of us are emphasising the need to talk about this issue and to not avoid it, and to recognise that the pastoral sensitivities around it require us to be compassionate and sensitive as we do so.
I think you mentioned a really good point, is that as Christians we shouldn't avoid this and bury our heads in the sand. So Steve, what can people do?
Educate yourself. I mean, nobody comes to this conversation from an objectively neutral perspective. So many of us, have known people that have died, or we've seen people that have been affected by really difficult end of life. So it's recognizing our own starting position, and then it's being open to understand the conversation and the debate from the positions of other people. Just try to educate yourself. And we are trying to produce resources across our different denominations. If they're not already up, they'll be on our websites soon, and we'll post them on the JPIT website very soon as well in the next few days. But if you do have a particular perspective, talk to your MP. I mean, we always say this at JPIT, don't we? This is something that is nuanced and complex, but ultimately on the 29th of November, MPs are going to be asked which side of the fence they land on this. And many of them are looking to their constituents to find out what they feel and what they believe so that they can be truly representative. It is a free vote as well. They're not being whipped. So your opportunity to influence and to make sure that your MP considers your perspective is particularly acute. And then talk about it in your home groups, talk about it with your friends. But as I say, always in the full knowledge of the pastoral sensitivities around the issue.
Steve, thank you so much for joining us and helping us reflect on this complex and important issue. I'm ever mindful that For many MPs, this will be their first significant free vote of conscience, and they will be bearing quite a lot of personal responsibility and listening to deeply personal and emotional stories. So whatever our stance, I want to encourage us to strongly to pray for our MPs and their staff during this time. Let us also be gracious in our correspondence with them, remembering the weight of the decision they are making. If you'd like support in engaging with your local MP, consider joining the JPIT's Constituency Action Network. It's a great way to connect with others who are building purposeful and positive relationships with their MPs and seeking to engage in love and hope. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. As people of faith, we're called to hold on to hope and to advocate for policies and practice that reflect God's justice and love. If you found this episode helpful, please like and share it across your social media. You can explore this and other important topics on our website, jpit.uk, where you find a wealth of resources on faith in public life. Until next time, I'm Nathan McGuire on the 10 Minutes on JPIT podcast. Stay engaged, stay prayerful, and let's continue seeking justice together.